A myth has been handed down to us through time, of a great island nation, ruled over by magicians, an island that was foretold would be destroyed in a great cataclysm. However, this isn't another version of the Atlantis myth, it doesn't even originate in the Old World. This story comes to us from the people who populated Easter Island, who believed they were the survivors, from another island, called Hiva. Very little detail has remained about Hiva, as most of what we have to go on wasn't written down in detailed records until the 1910s. Yet, these tales may have been passed on orally for nearly 2,000 years, only to be lost after centuries of wars, enslavement, and plagues. Even the name, Hiva, may show just how much has been lost, as the word is believed to mean something like, the distant land. We even have 3 alternative stories on why the settlers of Rapa Nui left Hiva: escaping civil war, the dream of the great chief about a distant paradise, and a prediction of a disaster that would destroy Hiva. There is reason to believe that the chief's dream may have been a later adaptation. It is also not inconceivable that the remaining 2 options were not alternatives, but part of the same original story. Although, I would admit that this may be a personal bias. After all, the combining of a great destructive war followed by a prophesied natural disaster is much like 2 other myths, the downfalls of Atlantis and Asgard. So, where was Hiva? The tales do seem to point to it laying west of Easter Island, and it may not necessarily have been destroyed. In a separate myth about the demigod Uoke, who tried to destroy Rapa Nui, using his giant lever to flip the land, he is often described as standing on Hiva for leverage. One possible location comes in the form of an island chain, now called the Isles of Hiva, which, using traditional sailing methods, is approximately 19 days sailing northwest of Rapa Nui. While now there are only a handful of islands above the waves, there was once many more. But the delicate geology has been battered by waves, earthquakes, and tsunamis, launched by the nearby Ring of Fire. So, is this the location of the lost island of Hiva? It seems rather simplistic, particularly since we have no way of knowing when these islands were given such a name. Remember, the name basically means distant land, or place in the distance. For the people of Rapa Nui, it seems unlikely that they would call what are almost a neighboring island chain a distant land. In fact, looking at that other Easter Island legend regarding Uoke and his lever, it seems they more likely believe such nearby islands were other pieces of a lost continent, which Easter Island was also a part of. This doesn't mean the end of the search. One of the reasons why the story is familiar isn't just due to the Atlantis myth. There are similar tales told throughout the Pacific, from the shores of Australia, right across to Central America. So, working under a presumption all these stories are connected, we're probably looking for a location to the western ends of the Pacific, an origin or central point that links these distant populations. Lying northeast of New Zealand, in the Java Sea, the island of Ambrym would seem to have little to do with this story, except perhaps as a stopover point as those early seafarers headed out into the Pacific. However, Ambrym Island has a vast caldera at its heart, linked to an eruption around 50 AD, one of the top 10 most powerful eruptions in history. It is the timing of this eruption that makes it interesting. Academics believe the main push to colonize the Pacific occurred in the 1st century AD, but they have been unable to explain what prompted a dangerous mass migration into the open ocean. Perhaps one of the most destructive volcanic eruptions in history sent a settled, multi-island population fleeing in all directions. The survivors were left with nothing but memories of a time when they were connected by the ocean as if they were on a single continent, before a biblical disaster left the people scattered and isolated. After all, we have seen just recently the power of much weaker eruptions in the region. The destruction of Hiva was said to have been foretold, and the people who lived on the edges of the Ring of Fire were probably aware of the warning signs of an impending eruption. While this theory would fit a more mainstream view of history, there are many who believe the settling of the Pacific, and these peoples landing on the South American continent, happened much earlier in history. For this there is another possibility, as an identical story but potentially much further back in history. Krakatoa has quite a reputation. Its eruption in 1883 created one of the loudest noises ever witnessed by humanity, resulting in the destruction of its own island, the deaths of over 34,000 people, and even affecting tides 7,000 miles away. In fact, the destructive power of this volcano has been so tremendous, that it is near impossible to accurately test for volcanic eruptions prior to the 1600s. Also, the Ring of Fire is known for more than surface volcanoes, and much of this activity, be it volcanoes, submarine volcanoes, earthquakes or tsunami, is a regular issue for the region between the Far East and Australia, the very region those early seafarers would have passed through. Either way, I believe the tales of Hiva do have historical merit, arguably more so than Atlantis. Although, it could be said that it seems more believable, due to the lack of information we have on Hiva, while we have a very detailed story about Atlantis, which leaves us struggling to find a location that fits that information. For me, the mass settlement of the vast Pacific Ocean, in a relatively short period of time, would require an origin from a well-populated, unified society. Such migrations, even when triggered by disaster, are usually the product of a booming population. This is why, I believe there to be historical relevance to the Pacific Ocean myths of a lost land, an Atlantis, of the Pacific. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was it the memory of a first-century disaster? An earlier tale passed down from a long-lost civilization? Or simply a story from a failing society?